is to work towards release. Last year we have a bug fix release. Now we are due to also to the nature of the open issues, we are oriented towards a minor release and not a major release according to the change and release management of DCAT-AP. This is triggered by the fact that we have quite a number of open issues that our aim is to reduce them. As well as to get aligned with the community of DCAT-AP as well as specification. This includes the last of things. One of the comments that we received and put into GitHub, we noticed that there is a very there is an interest and concerns on how the specification should be read and should be interpreted. This also relates to other existing solution and the relationship of DCAT-AP with other vocabularies and other representations such as DCAT as well as external vocabulary. So we feel that we need to somehow, with your help, your contribution, to see how we can express some interpretation rules on DCAT on application profile, on DCAT-AP as an application profile, how things, instructions, usage notes, and definitions on DCAT-AP should be read and expressed, and as well as interpreted. Always having in mind the purpose and the scope of DCAT-AP. We totally realized the fact that this came as a result of the evolution of DCAT-AP as well as other related vocabularies. So now we think that it's a good time to have some common understanding on interpretation, which is the main focus of today's webinar. We received 80 issues, and we deeply thank the contributors to those issues. We identified the 26 of them that could be easily somehow could be easily tackled, which are related to some bug, some editorial issues. But we identified the 54 that require the community alignment. So during this webinar, I would like to focus on those that will require your intervention and contribution, and we are leaving the rest of them to be addressed into GitHub. Here in this slide, you can find a URL, what will be the URL for the current proposal of the current draft. I would like to highlight the fact that this URL will be updated based on your contribution and this until we reach to the final version. Next slide, please. So this based on the 40, we classified the 54 issues into some conceptual categories. We saw that there are some issues regarding the representation as well as the reading and the profile extension issues, how certain classes or attributes are expressed, as well as issues in regarding the UML diagram. Was a long, great discussion regarding the usage and of that classes data set distribution data services, along with the usage and definition in DCAT-AP. So there was another big category alignment which has to do with alignment with DCAT with external vocabulary such as DCT terms. And what we will also like to introduce at the end of the webinar is our plan for a DCAT-AP study about the future of DCAT-AP. We will discuss also our next step, and in case there is enough time, we will tackle other issues that are related to shacl shapes and or specific property requests. And I give the floor now to my colleague Bert van Oefelen to begin to the conceptual topics.
Thank you, Pavlina, for the introduction. I will guide you through a number of, so the first topics, the conceptual topics. We have selected them to have, that this forms the basis for a new specification release. And as Pavlina already said, there are quite some number of issues, and there are two which we put in the annex, but these can be then tackled online in GitHub or in the second webinar that we have. Together with Max, we will go through these topics. So Max will be the typekeeper and keep an eye on the chat. So if you have anything to tell, highlight it in the chat or raise hands and so on. Max will keep an eye on that and intervene if I have not seen it, so that we can have a good discussion with you all. So the goal is to be interactive, and so Max will take care that the interaction will happen and that we have a good discussion on all the topics, and we see how far we get. Further, something else add, Max? No? Okay, then
it's okay. Okay.
Okay, so we start first with the profile topic. The reason why we have selected this is that there are a number of questions sometimes in the issues. Why is this property mentioned on this class and not on that class? Why is it not present in the UML, or why is it present in the UML? How are they in sync? And this is not always easy to give a straightforward answer if people read this in a different way. And so this first part is to an aim towards to create a common reading, common interpretation, a common way of the community from DCAT-AP to read DCAT-AP profile, and to be able to address this in a coherent way. One of the challenges, it's known, and DCAT is the so the vocabulary where we are basing ourselves on is a vocabulary with a lot of options, with a lot of possibilities and ways that we can extend in different ways, in many ways. And that thing means that we can have we have somehow to create a guideline for us as community, DCAT-AP community, how we can read it, how we can improve it, etc. This is not only on formal aspects, representation and interpretation side on this, but as well goes into scope agreements. What is inside scope of DCAT-AP and what's not inside of scope of DCAT-AP. We'll not be able to address all those things, certainly scope discussion, but that's something that can be addressed with the DCAT-AP study, for instance, that can be aiming us and to aid us to aid and guide us in this right of scope. But okay, we like to discuss with you to see a certain number of proposals in this context, and if we can build up this really. One first thing we would like to agree with you as community is that we sometimes see that people claim different masters of DCAT-AP. Some people say the shacl is the master, the other one says the RDF distribution is the master, the other one is the PDF or the human readable specification is the master. And our proposal is to take the human readable specification as the master. Why? Because in there we can express more subtle things like usage notes, intended usage, the definitions can be illustrated, etc. So this is harder to make in a formal language, in a pure formal language, in the UML diagram or in the shacl shape, etc. This is more a reflection of, as much as possible, the expressions, the intentions that are expressed in this human readable document. And we aim to make that as close as possible so that there's a minimal mismatch on it. But anyhow, we have to, I think it's good that we agree on what is the master and that we worked from that point onwards. Any objections? You can answer for this one, kind of good, +1, -1, if people to feel the water. I see that there's a lot of pluses. Yeah.
I'll see only agreement.
Okay.
Xavier or Matthias, if you want to extend a little bit. I think it's really, as was mentioned by Bert, it's really a fundamental aspect. And so before validating this, we want to make sure to, many of you have decades-long experience also with these processes. But I think looking at the chat, it seems that those who expressed an opinion are in favor. Would anyone have a different opinion on this based on your experience or your context?
Ludger Rinsche here for GovData DCAT-AP.de. So I agree that we have to decide which should be the leading representation, but still, if there's a difference between, for example, the shacl rules and the PDF, we still have to discuss if it's. But it's good to have a common agreement what should be the right representation. We have the experience in Germany that when we tried to make shacl rules out of free-form text from the documentation, that we realized that our shacl rules are more in line with what we wanted to achieve. So we had to adjust the written representation, but it's good to have a common ground to accept.
Yeah. I see a proposal from Xavier to do something like a guideline of what to do with your shacl if you have either valid or invalid results. And I think it's probably not something we can decide now, but it's probably good to keep that in mind in the documentation of the shacl shapes to see what you do when you get a particular result. So I think that's a good point.
Okay. Yes, yeah, that's something that we can take up in that context. Okay. So, yeah, then I want to give a bit of effect of what happens with profiling, just to illustrate the thing, what happens in the thinking. And and it's just, I think people around the table will agree to this. So if we have on the left-hand side DCAT and on the right-hand side DCAT-AP, and we have the same class, so dataset, datasets, or data service, something like this, and we have a property P on the more specific profile, DCAT-AP, then we aim to have the same semantics as happens in the upper or the original DCAT. So we want to have the same semantics. It might be more restricted, and we might add some additional things to it, but in the basis, the same semantics should maintain. If we look to new properties, so this is an extension element. So property R is a new property. It only exists in DCAT-AP, and this means that the only semantics are defined in DCAT-AP and how it should be used. And then, of course, there's a class of properties, and these are the ones which we sometimes have interpretations issues, is that there are properties Q defined in DCAT, but which have not been mentioned in DCAT-AP. And then it comes to what is the semantics? Can we use it? Can we not use it in DCAT-AP, and how to address it? One minimal requirement I propose to have is that if we have even local profiles, so the Norwegian DCAT-AP or the French DCAT-AP profile, that if they would introduce a property Q, a similar property, a new property, a non-result, that they have to look to even to DCAT if they can reuse it. And with the same semantics, so that everything is a coherent profile from each other. That's one thing. The same happens, and this is, we have subclasses. So suppose we create a subclass in DCAT-AP that is a subclass of the class A, then exactly the same elements and the same mechanism would be applied. So that is the idea over this. And that is, I think, what everybody mostly does and interprets. But I just wanted to make it in a few slides. Now, this comes then to what we want to have is we have here the challenge that DCAT is very open and has a lot of properties, and it's, we have two strategies. Either we copy whole DCAT as is, and we start fiddling on the specific elements that are specific to DCAT-AP in that specification, and then it's hard to see what is the difference between DCAT-AP and the additional elements and what is DCAT. Plus, that means if we do a copy, that it's a much stronger combination, a tightening of the both specifications. So if we want to keep them a bit loosely, have their own life cycle, then we have to make to represent them in such a way, certainly DCAT-AP, that we can have our own life cycle. And then it means that we have to have some adoption criteria for properties and classes into DCAT-AP and tell what we don't do or what we do with the properties that are in DCAT mentioned, but not mentioned in DCAT-AP. So we have thought of and considered on some base adoption criteria, which we would like to discuss with you for properties and classes to adopt in DCAT-AP. One first element that we would like to address is a business element. Namely, we would like DCAT-AP properties and classes to be connected to a cross-border or an EU-wide alignment use case. So we want to align on a life cycle of a data service. So then we look for properties and on that. And this is some need that we find that can be aligned across Europe, and therefore we add properties into it. And second is a more technical adoption criteria, is that if we then find a property in DCAT that might address the needs, that we want to express something additional to it, saying it must be, it is mandatory, or the code list to be used is this, etc. Because if there's no difference with the property in DCAT, then it's just a mentioning of that property in the specification of DCAT-AP, and then it's not unclear if there was a motivation to add it in or not. So then it's at the same level as any other property that already is mentioned, the property queues that are mentioned in DCAT. So we would like to hear your opinion on this. With this kind of idea to go forward to make an kind of a direction, a vision on, can we adopt this? Can we improve our specification that we link properties to a use case or to a cross-border need, and to make the specification in as such as well more readable.
Any comments there?
We consider this as a fundamental issue, so we would like to hear your opinion on this.
So Matthias here, to summarize, you are saying if you don't mention a property that is existing on DCAT, but you don't mention it on DCAT-AP, it is not part of the profile. It is not automatically inherited. That's one thing. And then additional properties needs to be motivated. You also want to sometimes refine existing properties when you mention them, that they have some additional restrictions. So that's three things you are saying, basically.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we want to, in the end, we want to make a DCAT that people are not questioning, why is this in DCAT and why is not this in DCAT-AP? And there's no difference between, for some properties, why they are listed or why they are not listed. So there might be historical reasons why they have been entered in there, but they actually in the execution way, there's no difference, and there's with what the discussions happens or with the specification in DCAT. So we make a stronger alignment in the sense with DCAT, in the sense of its possibilities. You can use it; it's not incorrect, but we will not make additional claims in DCAT-AP on those things.
Would it not then also be relevant to list properties from DCAT and say, if it has been discussed, why we have decided to exclude them?
Yes, that could be a good element into it. Yeah.
Making it easier to follow up in the longer perspective and to answer questions that appear over and again, why this haven't been included. Mm-hmm. This is especially important, I think, for data service, since it's kind of relevant new class and there is a lot of properties there that isn't mentioned in the 2.0.1 specification.
Indeed. Yes, that's one of the elements in here.
And we have like added 7 properties more, for instance, in the Swedish profile on that one.
Any other opinions?
And Ludger had a comment here, and I think we're coming back to that in 2 or 3 slides. So just hold on, Ludger, we're coming to that.
Yeah.
The reduction of properties.
Okay, good. Yeah. Then indeed, we prepared ourselves on the properties. We'll come to this. That is one for consequences. But before that, I would like to discuss with you then on one special class, the cataloged resource. There are many questions just popping up on the cataloged resource. it is in the context of DCAT meant as an editorial aid, an abstract notion to collect properties that are common to all cataloged resources with the same semantics in a broad sense. And it's not aimed to represent a business entity, at least at the level of DCAT. Now, it is hard to discuss on what is the meaning of, in that sense, then to a business need, what is the meaning of a cataloged resource. So if we adopt it in DCAT-AP, it would only be for the same reasons for the editorial perspective. Now, in order to make it simpler and to not overload DCAT with why it's there and why it's not there, our proposal is not to include it in DCAT-AP and only stick to the classes that have a clear business needs and the semantics around that. And then as a side effect, of course, copying, cataloged resource, not records. And then copying the properties that are specified for the business. It's not anymore. Okay, sorry. Typo. My question. So to include this not into the specification, but only at the dataset distribution data service to it. My apologies for the wrong URI. So this is kind of a fundamental in the representation, in kind of the way of handling for the profile. So it means that we don't have this generic abstract notion into the profile, but it is not incorrect. So it's actually even more strict in the sense that DCAT encourages us to be precise on what are the entities that we are putting in our catalogs and to be very concrete with that. So nothing will be lost. It is more not taking up this entity.
Matthias here, could I just ask one thing?
Yes.
When you then describe, I mean, the approach with the catalog resource is that you have to limit your duplication in the specification. Like the DCAT-2, you provide information on a higher level and you don't have to duplicate yourself or repeat yourself. Is the idea then in the specification that you would need to duplicate yourself anyway, because you will need to provide further refinement on each classes anyway? So is that an argument?
So it means that we have to duplicate properties like title and description, because there will be no difference probably in the handling of those properties, whether or not this is a dataset or distribution. That is very likely the case. But in many cases, there is a difference for some of the properties. So where we anyhow have to specialize them. For instance, categories. So the categories, if you categories or type data services, there will be another code list than the one that you will be using for datasets. So you have then to specialize anyhow, and then you get a mix of specialized properties and some that are on the cataloged resource. So what we say is we will try to do a little bit more effort, duplicate the things that are trivially common, but as a side effect, there's no discussion anymore on how to handle, for instance, DC type, like categorization, etc. It will be focused only in the scope of that class, dataset, or data service. So your scope is better. The reading of the properties will be better in the context. So that's the aim. So to make it more precise, more clear to the business entity. And then to be a bit of strict in it. So do not make a mixture between an abstract class and a concrete instance class.
Then Luger points to a Norway profile, how they handle this well in the UML diagram, and to be sure this is actually the same way that DCAT itself does it. So it provides the class DCAT resource, but then in the UML diagram, they show which of the properties of the resource are being used for example, for dataset. So it's, as Bert said, you might need, in some cases, cardinalities and controlled vocabularies in the usage node, but then in the UML diagram in DCAT and in Norway, they actually list all of them under the class that they use.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the way. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't inspected that one, so but okay. Yeah. Can Rutger, do you want to add something more than what Max said?
Yeah, for DCAT-AP DE 2.0, we were at the same point and decided to do it like Norway, because this way the information does not get lost, that a data set is a resource, and we don't have the problems with changing things from DCAT proper, because they say a catalog can have a resource, and then we would have to change this to can have a data set, data service, etc. So you don't lose this subclass system, but you don't make it complicated that you have to check properties in the resource and then say look at them in the data set and so on. So we thought this is a good compromise.
Okay.
Is it then the proposal, because there, I think that there is some people would like the proposal, but is it then the proposal that I look into the Norway approach and to see if this can be adapted or must be adapted?
I think that was one of the possibilities. It's the same way that DCAT proper and W3C does it. So we might want to see whether DCAT-AP can do the same.
Okay, I'll have a relook to it.
Yeah.
So that's the conclusion. But I see that that there is as well some support for this proposal.
Yeah.
I think DCAT proper does it a little bit different, because in the specification, they also explicitly say which properties are at the DCAT resource level, and my proposal would be to show the class in the UML diagram and say in the specification that it is for example, the dataset is a subclass of DCAT resource, but name the properties only at the dataset level, like you propose to do it now. So it's a combination. You don't lose the information that there is something like DCAT resource, but you don't give it so much weight.
Okay, so essentially in the diagram, we could use it to make it more readable, to highlight this kind of this thing, but in the specification, work according to these guidelines.
Yeah.
a comment from me here. The problem with the DCAT specification is that it is both an application profile and also introduces new properties. And when you introduce new properties, you have range restrictions, both domain and range restrictions. And then if you do a UML diagram, you indicate that you are somehow showing where the properties actually belong based on their domains.
Yeah.
While but at the same time, DCAT also reuses properties from other vocabularies like dubbing core, where you have a domain which is very flexible and very wide. Therefore, the V3C DCAT specification is a combination of an application profile and a schema, or and we don't have that problem on DCAT-AP. It is purely an application profile. Therefore, I would argue that it makes sense to consider the UML diagram more of a pure application profile where you only list properties based on their restriction and usage scenario rather than where their domain originally comes from.
Yeah.
So it's the approach with Norway is very good because it just shows that there is a class, but it's just there.
Okay, I'll have a look to it. I'll see if I can address it in that way. Thanks for the pointer. And see if we can refine this proposal. And there are still some comments that in the next slides, and we might see if this has influence on this. Okay. Okay, so the next one was, and this is already that listed, that if we take out and look to the properties and classes that we have, and if we see the adoption criteria that I just presented before, what is the effect? And then just look to them, to the specification, and this is the list of properties which have no or minimal difference with DCAT. Minimal, I mean, there's a slight difference in the usage node, but not something that is majorly different. It's probably more an editorial change than something semantically meaningful. And these are the properties that are fully optional, have no added value unless there is some additional motivation that we could find in the history of DCAT-AP. So it might be that on these properties we have to look say we can reduce it, or we say it is important that we keep it in order to give a better message or a particular attention to it, to this. Our proposal is not to change anything for now, but look in the next iteration, not this release, but in the next iteration, what could we do better? So what can we do with these properties? Do we drop them and say DCAT actually handles them? They were introduced in DCAT-AP 1 because they were not in DCAT 1 at that time, and now actually in DCAT 2 and 3 they have been adopted and being set much better and defined much better. Secondly, we could add the following sentence. So any property that is mentioned in the DCAT applicable to this class, but which is not explicitly listed in DCAT-AP, is considered to be an optional field for DCAT-AP. So it says nothing more than we propagate the knowledge, the rules, the agreements of DCAT to DCAT-AP. And that are the two elements for this. What do you think of this approach?
I think to answer to what Ludger said earlier, this would mean that in future versions of DCAT-AP, the specification becomes shorter because we're going to delete optional properties that are don't have a specific usage node and use case. Luca is okay with that. And Jim in Norway as well.
Yes, but I have a question. If you go one slide back,
Yes.
So if I understood you correctly, you're saying that in the long term, the theme for catalogs will not be mentioned explicitly in DCAT-AP because they are the same in DCAT-AP as in DCAT. And
yes, at this moment. So this is the list. This is just the analysis. This is just no. So if the community, DCAT-AP community says, well, actually it seems at the catalog level, or I take one which is more important, I think, even download URL for distribution. If we don't say anything more of it than DCAT, and we don't feel, passionate about this property, then there's no need to keep it. However, okay, it might be that you say, okay, I actually have a good reason. This is the way that aids us in a particular way. We can motivate it better if we motivate it, and then we keep it. So that's the reason why this is just an assessment to give you the impact, the possible impact.
Yeah, to stress this point, for me, the important sentence is we don't have any strong feelings about this property because, for example, the download URL is something I think should definitely be mentioned in DCAT-AP for distribution, even if it's exactly the same as in DCAT. So because we are expecting every distribution to have a download URL, so under this, with this second sentence, I could agree.
Yeah,
so we would have to check for every named optional element if there is a good reason to name it in DCAT-AP.
That's the idea, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And Jim, this only applies to optional properties, as this slide says, not to the recommended ones or the mandatory ones.
No, because to the recommended and mandatory properties, we already have classified them as recommended or mandatory. So that means we have already put an extra qualification to it. Of course, if we say a property is not anymore recommended but becomes optional and we have not added anything more to it, then it becomes part of this discussion again. But if we just stick to what is currently mentioned, this is only to the optional properties which have no or minimal difference with DCAT, and these ones we have to take a closer look at and say, what is the value of these properties in the context of DCAT-AP, and if we want to address this more.
But this assumes that the only value of DCAT-AP is about restrictions that you can encode in shacl profile. If you have a value that you are providing a better name for a property to present in some user interface, or a guiding information about how to think of an optional property, then we have something to say. So when there is value to provide, and I would say that's probably everywhere, I don't see that we can't provide. I mean, okay, I don't know exactly, I haven't compared all of them, but I would say that there are additional information regarding naming and some kind of text on all of the optional properties.
In principle, yes. That's the reason. But at this moment, if we just look purely to the specification as it stands today, there's no difference. So it means that we have to do effort here on our side to make the readers of DCAT-AP specification more aware, saying we did some efforts to highlight that download URL is relevant and should be used in this way, although even it is an optional property. That is the only message to be given here.
What about the cardinality?
A cardinality, whatever cardinality means that there's already something US. So you will see that in this list, there are some properties not taken, not listed just because they have a max cardinality of 1. So from the moment there's something added, I have not listed it here in this. So that means if there's some formal statement made for whatever reason in DCAT-AP, then they are already not listed in the option. So this is just the list of properties where we have to do some extra work. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
And on Ludger's comment, there will be non-mentioned optionals and mentioned optionals.
Yeah.
And the non-mentioned optionals do not just include everything that is in DCAT and not in DCAT-AP, but also anything else. Prof, Dublin core, anything that can be added, which is basically open world assumption. You can say anything, but you only are interested in the ones that are in the specification. And of course, the mentioned optional properties are also in the conformance statement. And the non-mentioned are not in the conformance statement. You don't know what happens. There's no need to do anything with them. For the optional ones, you're actually, as a receiver, still required to do something. And not.
That's the reason, indeed, why we have to be careful what we expect with it or not. So if we really mention it, then we expect that the receiver is capable to process it and to store it.
But from a tool developer's perspective, this means that it is a bit more unclear what it would mean to have DCAT-AP not compliant, but that you support DCAT-AP, because according to the open world assumption, that would be an infinite task to provide all optional values. If you have a list of all optional properties, then it becomes clear. If you have non-mentioned optionals, that makes it very unclear, unless you say that there is an assumption that since this is a profile of DCAT, DCAT-AP also have the optionals that come from the DCAT is somehow included as an optional state. So it needs some kind of clarification, I would say, even if we don't mention them.
Yeah, so that's one attempt of this sentence B, is one of these attempts. Maybe it's not perfect, because DCAT has as well, in some cases, a very open statement. Everything that has to do with relationships, they say first look to DC terms, then to prof, and then to anywhere else. So there's there are some open-ending gaps as well in DCAT.
In theory, I agree with Matthias as well, but I think what we are describing is okay and not more complicated for tool builders, because what we are saying is if we don't mention an optional in DCAT-AP, we just say, well, use it if you want, because we are in open world and DCAT has this property. But for DCAT-AP, we don't have any special, we don't see any special value for this option. And I think this is what it's at the moment already. So we could add the RDFSC also at every property, but that doesn't make it more complicated for tool builders. You're just saying, just put it on a you're just saying how you're handling optionals in DCAT. I think it makes sense.
Okay, so we try to improve on that. So in this idea, take that on that. Okay, then it comes up to the qualification of these classes. We have and properties. We have mandatory, recommended, and optional qualification. We propose to add deprecated. It has been needed already because DCAT deprecated some properties. which are in the optional section, etc. But anyhow, we had no definition for it. So this is our proposal. Then, and this is something more question, I would like to go to it, is to the community, what do you expect with the statement of a mandatory class? Because it is unclear to me to say in the end what is the effect of it in the whole DCAT-AP specification. Because if you say that what I have to say, if you say that dataset is a mandatory class, then you could derive from it that you have to provide at least one instance of that class into the catalog that you're sharing. But then means that you cannot share an empty catalog anymore, and even more if it becomes to some sub classes which are supporting in like category, etc., because they are recommended classes. So the category is recommended. What does that mean? And so it's close to mandatory. That's so I would like to hear what the community is expecting from this statement.
Any comments? Luca?
I don't think it's possible to say the class is mandatory according to Lutger.
Yes, you gave the example already with the empty catalog or a data set which is not connected to a catalog.
Yeah.
I don't see why RDF statement about just a data set should be considered invalid just because we don't know which catalog is linking to it, and that is the result in the shacl shapes for now. So maybe the sender must provide information about instances of the class if the use case includes the class or something like that.
Yeah.
That makes more sense because right now we may have catalogs which only contains data services. And from this perspective, this would break as well. So there are a few cases.
Hagar, would you like to jump in to share your views?
Yes, no, I agree with, I'm not so sure about mandatory classes, but for dataset, which is, I guess, the heart of of the specification, it is already mandatory because DCAT's dataset property of a catalog is mandatory. So, but this would solve the problem of addressing it, the class itself as mandatory, but it is de facto mandatory.
Yeah, so I would like that's the side effect. Some of the properties enforce existence of instances, connect the network, and we do it through the properties. But the independent statement of a mandatory class. So what is the expectation there? That's,
In fact, I never understood this. I always ignored it from the perspective of a tool developer. It doesn't make sense. The only thing you know is that you need to deliver a catalog, and it may or may not have data sets filled in within it and data services.
Are there any others like Matthias that ignore this qualification for classes?
Well, in Germany, we import the data from our data providers into a SPARQL endpoint, and we don't have a catalog in this endpoint. So we ignore it as well, because the endpoint itself is the catalog of data. Yeah. And The cardinality of lowercase dataset is something that I would consider a mistake, especially now with the possibility of catalogs and the possibility of catalogs of data services. So I think it's not possible anymore to say it's cardinality one to many for dataset, because it doesn't have to be this way.
That's one of the elements that we might have to discuss to say this is not meaningful anymore. I see that a lot of people around the table actually ignore this classes. So except of existence of the class, that it means, and that it's deprecated, and it means that it has been removed from the specification. That are the elements that I would use on my behalf. But for the rest, I wouldn't use. I would only look to these qualifications of the properties as well. That's my most interpretation.
Yeah, I would be fine with removing this section altogether and just talking about it, that you would expect there to be a catalog and maybe some data sets and data services, and the rest is up to the, but just say something about the expectation, not express it this way.
Okay, good. Then this is a suggestion that we replace the formal statements on these mandatory classes with a statement about what we expect to be in a catalog and what are the elements to be there and which cases we would like to allow.
Yeah, I think that's a good proposal. Replace it by a section with expectations rather than with these classification of mandatory and recommended for classes.
Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you. Well, okay, then we have addressed the profile a lot. Now the effect of that. So I prepared based on these settings and these proposals a new UML figure, because the old one, as you know, is hard to read and not easy to penetrate. So, and there were a number of issues specifically asking, is this in or out the UML diagram? So there's a new diagram being presented. According to the discussions we had, the proposals we made before, you can browse into it, but what are the rules that I used? So the goal is to intend a visual overview of the specification. So it's not a formal specification as formal definition of DCAT-AP. So you have to read it as illustrative in the sense of to give, if you have a mental mind of what is the intent of that. It will not contain every supporting class as a class box. So it will be shortened in that, more compact. I did not include all the literal ranges because some of them have ors or unions, and then it becomes a very long list and this kind of thing. And like mentioned before, if there's a property that is not mentioned here, but it exists in DCAT, it does not mean it's prohibited. So it's kind of the open assumption, the open world assumption. If we look to it, so if I zoom in, then you have here a literal property issued with its cardinality that's present, but not with the XSD types. Then we have relationships or associations, how you call it in UML, or properties, object properties that point to other classes that are explicitly mentioned. There are arrows. If they are not explicitly mentioned, then the range is mentioned explicitly in the property, like for landing page. So that's the difference to make it more compact. So that should make already our specification, or at least the UML diagram, more readable and more discussable. And I listed as well a qualified optional versus recommended mandatory properties. If we look into the UML figure, one element I just want to highlight and shortly discuss with you is that we use URIs for the properties, although every property in the specification is starting from a human readable label. And this might clash, might not clash. Suppose, and this is an imaginary example, if you have the class dataset and we have two properties, GDPR risk category and dataset popularity level, and we would both map them to DC type, then there's no way that this figure can show a distinction between the two. There will be DC type in there. So we cannot make a distinction if there are two properties with different labels, with different semantics, but mapped on the same URI. And so there are two discussions here. Should we use the URI style still in the UML figure? And maybe if this mapping on the same URI in the same class is a good practice. So that might be another discussion. And then if people say that one is not a good practice, then the UML diagram with the URIs is still valuable or is equivalent. So it's a bit of where do you want to have the solution.
Could I just make a quick comment here? I'm very, well, not so happy about UML diagrams in the context of RDF because they are so problematic. Would it be, maybe an option would be to make a very much simpler UML diagram with only the class names to give an overview. So what is the purpose of this diagram? Is it for implementers to look at this and see this is the truth? Or is it for people who are reading the specification the first time to get an overview and a feeling? If it's the second thing, I would think just showing the classes and how they relate makes more sense. And then after that, have a table like an overview that is already provided, but in Annex 1, which lists in much more detail the actual properties that you have on each class. Yeah, and that wouldn't be so hard to read. Also, you have to have prescription glasses to see everything here. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, so since it's in my opinion, this figure is more illustrative. So the second case, aiding people to guide or to browse through the specification, not as a formal specification of the formal representation of the specification, because this is not complete in any sense formally.
I think also at W3C in the specification of DCAT proper, there is this discussion of what this diagram actually tells you, because in the specification there is actually a more elaborate description of what goes into the properties for every class, and there are it's also a maintenance issue, I think, where you have to make sure that they keep aligned. So Matthias' proposal is to make the diagram simpler and only indicate relationships between the classes and not the whole list of properties that are described somewhere else in the table. And Luther says, it would make it easier to maintain the correctness. As we've also seen at W3C, that there are some errors in the diagrams and then people start worrying about which one is the right one. Okay, so I think that would be something that we could look at, making the diagram simpler.
Yeah, we can make it even more simple. So that's...
And my question for your second question here about mapping of two properties on the same URI. There is a specification issue there or a diagram issue, but isn't it the same if you have the same property for two things, that when you get information, you're not able to relate them to the right property? So if you get information, you get two types of the DC type, you don't know which one is what. Is that not correct?
That's indeed, you cannot make a distinction anymore. You have to look to the value to know which, whether you're talking about the GDPR risk category or the dataset popularity level.
In my sense, I think it's a bad practice to map two properties to the same URI, because then basically you're saying they have the same semantics.
At least in the context of one class. In the context of
yeah. I don't know if there are any other comments there.
If you do it like you say on the page, then you would have two DCT types, which is not allowed according to this picture. So this would be another problem. And I don't see. I would strongly recommend to stay at the URIs and not use some property labels, because they are. It would confuse me a lot. Yeah, but I'm not sure if this mapping problem is something we have to solve on the specification level. As Max said, this sounds like a bad idea to do it this way.
Or if I may add, a suggestion or an option would be to specialize the properties, like define specific properties as sub-properties of DC type. So you know that this property is kind of DC type property, but specialize it so you have an idea of what the property is about, like popularity or risk category.
Yeah, in fact, Anastasia, what also in DCAT proper, for example, DCAT theme is a subproperty of DCT subject, because it has a specific meaning in the context of DCAT.
Yes, and like dataset, it's a subproperty of has part. They use the has part as a super property.
Okay, but that's a good suggestion, and that's really fine. Okay, good. Then I'll leave profiles for now. It was the last slide on profiles. So thank you for your feedback. Oh, yeah, that's one. Now I want to move to another big topic of discussion where we would like to align on is the meaning of what we expect to be in a data set, in a distribution, and in a data service. That is a challenge in the sense that we know this data service is recently added, and many of our portal or publishers have not yet moved away from the dataset distribution case, but they still use and mix everything into one. And now it would be good to have some guidelines and to be more precise, or to give some direction with you as a community. What do we expect in a dataset distribution, and what do we expect in a data service? And that would aid us as well to make properties more appropriate, more meaningful for those classes. There are some issues, as you see, that are related to that, and that would be addressable if we somehow can get and create a guideline, a usage note, and direction into it. This is the challenge that we want to do, and this might be leading to a set of kind of a guideline on preferred modeling or preferred way of representation, the metadata, and a set of examples where we say, okay, in this example case, it is best to be represented as a distribution or best to be represented as a data service. So that we create this, and this might be a living part of the specification, this kind of set of examples. So if we look to the different aspects, I will just go to it and then open the discussion. One of the elements is that if we look to existence dependency, then we can see that the distribution as it on its in its own actually cannot exist. So we don't have a catalog of distributions. No, we have a catalog of data sets and data services. And the distributions are things that are connected to the data sets. So you only can have distributions if you have a data set in your catalog. And that is the idea that it happens in there, at least at the level of DCAT. So where these entities are dependent and independent from each other. So data set and data service can exist independently from each other. If we look to DCAT-AP, then historically there has been added an extra stronger dependency, namely that the idea was to open up data, to make data more available, and therefore it is a strong incentive in DCAT-AP that data sets without distributions are not good things. They are incomplete. They can be represented, but actually it is not the desire to happen. So the goal is to have a data set with distributions that at least in DCAT-AP, this is kind of the spirit that it was there, because we want that people can have access to the data. That's the motivation. If we then look, take another perspective to give us guidelines of what we can expect from distributions and data services and data sets, then if we look to distributions particularly, we see a lot of properties that are file-oriented, which we typically use in the context of files. Byte size, checksum, a particular modification date, the download URL. It's typically terminology which we use in context of files and which we are not using in context of services. The reason is that services, a lot of these properties are actually not so relevant because services can do transformations on the fly. So the format is not kind of fixed. You ask to the service, give me the data in a particular format. So the format is less important than in a file. Same for languages, you can ask to a service and give me the data in a particular language. In a file, you would say it is in this language and it's stored in this language, and it was in languages. Even smarter services might do even schema transformations on the fly, etc. And in the end, if you look to kind of checksum and byte sizes, so typically on services, you only can get the data if you have somehow authenticated, get a key or something like this to access the service and to do something with it. And therefore, you actually have already established kind of a trust relationship. So there's no need to recheck afterwards what has come over the wire, whether or not this was valid or not. It might be in some cases needed, but it is not very often the case because you already have established a base level of trust. So that is, if we look to properties, that they are in the set of distribution more to file-oriented, a lot of them, and that in services this kind of is lifted. As I already mentioned, so the current practice, many portals and so on still propose this and propagate this information that APIs and file dumps are all considered distributions. We have not made the major shift to data services and distributions, and that's what we would like to do now. In short, and this is the discussion I would like to have with you, is that that distributions would be more for file accessed content of the data set. So if you have a data set, then if you want to share the data as a whole and with all the information, all the data points available, then this is kind of a distribution, and this is downloadable or collectible by the user. So in one way or one other way, the user can download, can get the data in full on his own site to do something with it, and use data service for anything else. As a consequence, and this is already mentioned, catalogs without datasets here is datasets without distributions are very valid, because the data is not anymore available made through a file dump, but only through an API. And that is a data service, and therefore there is no distribution anymore needed or required for a dataset. Just for the examples, and it's open discussion. So examples of distributions, if we look to files, then RDF file dump, a CSV downloadable file, a zip of Excel files, even a JPEG with a heat map on it, in the sense that these are downloadable things, and somehow the information is encoded in there and extractable. Whereas if we look to services, examples would be Sparkle endpoint, a REST API for a register, a WS Geo service, or a download service that would allow to parameterize somehow selection criteria for the data, and then provide the result of this selection criteria as a dump. So that is the opening of the proposal, and have a discussion with you. Is this the right direction to go, to base a guideline upon? Are there things that we should improve? Wrong ideas about it? That is.
I see Jim Young agrees that distributions are for file-based access.
Yeah. So Jim agrees to it.
Are there people who disagree?
One question. I mean, again, we don't actually use data service yet to model our distributions or our data sets, but I think it might lose out on the connection that can be modeled between distributions and data services if we treat them as alternative solutions.
What do you mean with loose connection?
Well, indicating a distribution as available through a data service, basically, if we put them as alternative to one another.
This is on the portal side, and I agree, portals, if you make a UI out of it, the thing becomes a bit more complicated. It means that the simple question, give me all ways to access a data set, to get access to this data, is not only give me the elements that are findable through distribution relationship, but as well to all these data services that are serving that data set. So the question by this model, by DCAT, already opens this in the sense that it is more complicated to answer that question.
Yes,
from the perspective from the UI or from the catalog portal. That's inherent to it.
Hello, Matthias here. Sorry, I was trying to follow. I've been driving here. You're saying that we don't. Okay, so let me take a Swedish example. We have a statistical agency that provides 4,000 data sets, and they have an API. Yes. So what we've done is that each data set or statistical table, they want to present that this information exists. So what they do is that they provide each one of these as data sets, and then they have a single data service that also is the actual endpoint where you can access all these data sets. It's a REST-based API, which means that there is a direct URL to each data set. Yeah. This way of doing it is quite good, nice, because it promotes both their well-known API as well as a view of all the data sets.
Yeah.
So in this case, we have both. And I think it's not a good idea to say that things that are available via data services should not be exposed as data sets, because conceptually what you access via a service is a data set. So just because the way you're accessing a data set is via a service, it shouldn't exclude you from providing it as a data set as well. But maybe I misunderstood because I was on the driving at the same time.
Yeah. So the relationship, I didn't close the whole loop. So between the relationship between distribution and data service, the assess service relationship, yeah, that is something which becomes, in my proposal, less required or less popular to be used. It's more that every data set and data service can be exist in their own right. Like your example, you have a few thousand data sets, one data service that serves all those data sets, and that you can link with each other, and that's fine with me. That's exactly the objective. If you would like to say, and this is an extra effort, if the statistical office say, okay, actually, I want to make a specialized data service for every data set, and so with the full path to it, and I as well will register that, then I have as many data services as there are data sets, but that will be still data services, but no distributions.
So what I'm trying to be against is that you are not listing things that existing services as data sets. If you don't want to provide 4,000 data sets, that's fine. Then you provide just one data set saying this is about the statistical data, and via the distribution you point to the data service. I don't think it's a good idea to say then you can exclude the data set altogether, because that's conceptually wrong, because then you're not telling about the data set that exists.
And you wouldn't be able to describe the metadata for the data set, because then you wouldn't know, then the data service is just a black box that serves whatever you want. I agree with you, Matthias, that if there is, there's data sets there, then you need to describe the data sets as data sets and the data service as the way to access them.
Yes. And the only case you would want to describe a data service without having an associated data set would be if the data service is not really focused on a data set. It would be some other kind of calculation device or service which allows you to send in the declaration or something, but then maybe it's not a data service. So yeah, what case do we have when we have data services that are not connected to data sets? That's what I'm wondering.
That last case, I think, is by DCAT allowed. That's allowed. That's intentionally and explicitly listed as a potential data service, an instance of it. However, I don't think this is the most interesting services so far at this moment in the context of an open data portal. If you look to an open data portal, then I would probably be watching and say, okay, data services without a data set, that is maybe we have a closer look at. So I agree with you in that sense that we have to look, but I would not exclude it as such, but it's probably not the most useful, or at least not the ones, the priority for open data portals.
Yeah, I think that's important, Bert, that you're saying, well, we have use cases.
Yes.
Currently, we don't have use cases of data services without data sets. So that I would think that in the specification of DCAT-AP, we need to say something like this diagram, where we say what is expected, but we don't go out into what if and situations that we haven't considered. So this is something maybe in the future there might be cases like Uwe here identifies the transformation services, but currently we don't do that. So I think for the current situation, we want to keep things simple in that sense, with a guideline as you just have on the slide here.
I see that Luther has commented some additional things. Luther, do you want to add something more?
Not much more than I wrote. So we are trying to. We are at the same point for DCAT-AP DE 2.0 to give guidance to data providers how to use the data service, and there we have the additional rules on not on the level of the specification, but in our implied rules that a distribution that has an access service is not allowed to have a download URL, and that it has to use the access the endpoint URL of the data service as its access service access URL. So that's these just to give guidance to the data providers. And then we also had this discussion about data services who don't have data sets because they offer services like transformation, and we have already a use case at a data provider. So I would be happy if you don't set a rule that it is not allowed to have these, but you can of course give guidance that you, so please don't make them forbidden.
Can you give us then, you can send an email or something like this then, with the precise use case, because these are kind of things that in kind of the examples would like to list. If we create a kind of a guideline based on this, where we can say, look, in this case, there is a single data service disconnected.
May I suggest something, Bert, here? If we're talking about new use cases that we haven't considered. So my proposal would be that in the next round for DCAT-AP, we might look at additional use cases and seeing how we can integrate them, rather than doing it as a guideline now at this point. I think that we need to look at specifically what is requested, and also proposals by Germany, for example, to how that can be integrated in DCAT-AP. And I don't think that we are in a situation now to actually look at the details of that, if that's okay with you.
Okay, but good. Anyhow, if you can share the use case, then we can already have a look.
We can also create a comment into GitHub with a specific use case in order, for example, to trigger our audience to provide other use cases, people that are not here today in the webinar, so that they can see it and provide their own use cases.
Yeah, that's all. Anyhow, we'll create an issue for this collective issue.
I have a comment to Ludger's comment in the chat. In the scenario I just described with the statistical service, we do not point with the access URL to the same URL as we do with the endpoint URL, because the data service have kind of a root URL, the endpoint URL to the service, which is wide and service is 4,000 data sets, while each individual data set of these 4,000 has a more specific URL, which we provide in the access URL. And then we point to the data service, of course, via access service. Or what is it called? Yeah, access service. To where you can see this is the wider service from where we are actually working and retrieving this data set.
This is similar.
Point, yeah.
This is a similar case that in the geospatial world, they often have for example, have with the download service. So you can download a piece of a map and you parameterize it. And it means that you allow users to find or select a piece of data that is relevant to their use case.
Exactly.
And that is considered to be a data service. Whereas if you would have the fully parameterized setting the description of the service, the HTTP with from this bounding box and in these layers, etc., that could be considered as a download URL for a dataset. Because it's fully parameterized, it's fixed, nobody can change it, and you can say, okay, if you want to download it, well, it goes to the same service, but we have prepared for you a fully parameterized one. And
that's true. We might have to reconsider this, yes. Thank you.
Perhaps Uwe wants to share something with us. He made a lot of comments in the chat, but we never heard from him.
Can I say it as well? I do not see the difference between a data access service and a download service. That is what I wrote in the chat, because also a download service is a kind of API with very simple HTTP GET with some kind of endpoint and response format. So I guess as long as we do not consider these use cases with sending CD, for example, by mail, then we have it to do only with data services, right?
This is the indeed, how far do you go? Do you consider HTTP as a service or not? And this is sometimes in discussions I had as well. Yeah, some people follow that, some people don't follow it, and it's a border case. Huh? That's the reason why I tried to organize distribution according to, you can get the full data set. So the data set describes the data in a conceptual way, what kind of information you get. And the distribution is the concrete information, the metadata to get access to the concrete in full. It might be that you have to do still some iterations. So next, because if you download CERN data, experiment data, that might be, you cannot download it as such, but you have to download it in pieces.
So
you can get
the only difference is that it is not pre-packed, because with a service you can do some kinds of filtering and selections. That's the only difference in that moment, where you can also request, for example, a zip file instead of the original format. Then you have also some parameterization, and you do a kind of projection. You say what you do not want the pre-packed format, but you want it in zip format. And for me, there's no difference between an API and a download. It's a more an artificial.
It's to a certain extent is an artificial level. It will be. There's a reason why we cannot probably be very strict about it. But let's say that distributions or download URLs are simpler things, very simple ways to get the data with no or very minimal human interaction. Parameterization, you cannot change anything anymore. Whereas in data services, you have parameters, you have to do some thinking to get the data.
I guess it's the same distinguishing what we have in the Earth observation context. There you have these predefined data sets, and you have these kinds of data cubes where you can grab into and select only specific subcubes of these data sets, and that is the main difference, I would say.
Yeah, and unfortunate, and this makes it a kind of complicated, of course. If you build a data service with some parameterization and some smart abilities that users can do, they have the capability to be very, very simple. If you fixed all the parameters and so on, so they serve both purposes in that case.
Yep.
So that means that it becomes a gray zone.
Shall we move on, Bert?
Yeah.
20 minutes left.
Okay. So I will create an issue on this. There were several issues already where there kind of these ideas are being illustrated. This is kind of to introduce to you this kind of idea. And if you feel that this is restricting too much or goes too far in the guideline, then please give comments.
So I think, yeah, Bert, I think what we need is sort of examples. And there were some examples given, and then we can describe how we think that should be done so it is not interoperable. Okay, let's
so that we have some guidelines based by examples saying this is the best practice in this case or based in that. Good. Then we have the last topic for the day that is going a little bit further. We have alignment with external vocabulary. So DCAT and DCAT-AP are based on other vocabularies, including DC terms, as already mentioned earlier in the meeting. And there has been a slight change in DC terms in 2020 to mainly change ranges. And in the DCAT community in the W3C, they said we are not going to change our approach. So our proposal is we are following DCAT in this case, and we are not going to change anything. So we claim that we have addressed the alignment with DC Terms 2020 changes. So there's nothing to do because DCAT at W3C level maintained the way how it was represented before, and this is equivalent to what we have in DCAT-AP. So unless we are going to rechange, if there's something here to be changed, then I propose to move it to W3C and to discuss it over there. That will be the better place. Then something related. So of course we align with DCAT. So this is a main alignment. There were some comments made that definitions usage nodes are not perfectly aligned with DCAT. And this one we should address, but our proposal is not to address it now immediately in the next release, but in a future release when we would create an HTML representation, because the best approach to tackle this alignment is that we can make references to DCAT, copy the definitions at the right place, and have the DCAT-AP additions in usage nodes and more specific elements much more elaborated. If we would do it now, then we have to do this change again, and we need to use it later on. So the proposal is to postpone this work to the HTML representation. So that will be much easier. There are no major issues at the moment, right? So there are a little bit all the definitions. If there's something is really awkwardly and wrong, we will address it anyhow. But at this moment, it's more editorial wise than it is semantically an issue.
Okay.
And then, of course, last thing, DCAT is not standstill. It's a living community, as we know. There are two topics that are currently in DCAT 3 or upcoming release is being discussed: series and versioning. So we just want to announce that at this moment, you can still have ability to discuss over there. And if you want to have recommendations and that you would like to see, try to discuss them first at the level of DCAT. And then if there's some more restrictions, say if you want to have a cardinality or so on particular cases, then we would adopt this in DCAT-AP. So that would
just to make a case for that, the work at W3C for DCAT-3 is nearing its completion. I would expect that we're going to have a public review somewhere in the next 2 months, and people at W3 are very keen to take into account all kinds of comments and opinions to make that to actually meet people's requirements. So if you have the opportunity, either now through the GitHub at W3C or at the time when there is a full public consultation, then I think that would be really helpful, because then after the publication of DCAT-3 at W3C, we can start working those new issues into DCAT-AP in the next year.
This might also trigger us for a new major release. That's why we said today we are in a minor release. Not, I think that it is clear that to Javier that asked that we are going on a minor release and not backfix release, and we are following the DCAT-3 to launch potentially probably a major release.
Yeah, and also I make sure that those things, versioning and series, are things that have already been implemented in the current situation of DCAT-2 at W3C. So there might well be quite a little some discussion about how that the interoperability between current ways of doing that and the new ways of doing that. And I think that would certainly be something for a major release, and not at this point in time. It's too early to do that. Okay.
Okay, and then as I showed, we will do even work towards a future and a long-term outlook to prepare ourselves for that. And Max?
Yeah, so I can say some words about that. So the idea is that where we have DCAT-AP implemented in various places, and what we really want to do is see how we want to continue in the future. What kind of things do we need to plan for the next 2 to 3 years? And what we're starting to do now is we're, as Bert has done for this meeting, analyze the GitHub issues, but then look at sort of what kind of functional requirements can we see there on a sort of a higher level, not just on the technical level, but on the functional level. And we're also going to do that analyzing national and domain-specific extensions, so that we also see what kind of things people are now implementing that go beyond what is in the European DCAT-AP, and seeing whether, as Bert said earlier, one of the criteria is that they are useful on a cross-domain European level, and see how we can convert those into issues for future development. So those potential functional improvements, and then also at the same time looking at what is going to happen at W3C in DCAT-3 and the things that are on the list for DCAT-4 for the next years. And then we want to come up with some recommendations for this group to see what we're going to do in the next year, the next 2 years, and next 3 years with a time plan. And then we have a list of things that we already know we're going to look at, apart from the GitHub that are being discussed in this group. We have a list of national profiles that we know are implemented, and some domain-specific profiles. But what we really would want the group to do is provide us also with with links to other profiles that we weren't aware of at the moment. So if there is a possibility for people to come up with new profiles, then you either can do that in the chat, or you can send the message to us after the webinar, so that we can take into account those profiles in analyzing what the functional requirements are going to be in the next 2 or 3 years. We are also going to look at how we can involve people more directly. So in the process of the study, we will try and put in some focus groups, and we haven't actually had a complete proposal of how to do that, so that we can actually discuss draft recommendations and conclusions that we have from our study, so that everybody can comment and we can make sure that the final result meets people's requirements, even if we might not be able to implement and plan all of it in the period that we're looking at, but certainly try to use as much as possible the knowledge in this group also to make sure that we're taking the right direction.
Thank you, Max. So if there are any feedback, let us know. We will hear more about it.
And Sebastian, yes, it might well be that the plans for various profiles have some interference with the plans for DCAT-AP, but certainly what we want to do in the study is bring out those issues so that we can discuss them.
Yes, we were very interested in hearing other usages of DCAT-AP apart from the well-known national profiles. So any feedback and input on this would be very valuable for us.
That's it.
Yeah, Max, I think, or Bert, we can jump to the next steps.
Okay, sorry, I was saying I was muted. For the next steps, so we include at the end of the meeting, and thank you for your contribution. But now the homework starts, and the homework we have organized it as follows. So we are today mid-September, and we are preparing the candidate release, and we will go then to a public review of a month. To reach the candidate release that we will put in public review, we take approximately a month time, but we will freeze the GitHub from our perspective on the 1st of October. So that at that point in time, we look to all the issues. If we have addressed them, can we prepare a release, a candidate document, new specification based on that, that we can send to you all in the community to have comments on. As you have seen, we have not addressed all the issues, in particular, some particular individual elements. And yeah, we want to see if we can address and get these as well addressed in the during the public review. There are, for many of them, resolutions provided, but some of them, they require much more feedback from the community. So there's a request from somebody saying, okay, I would like to have a max cardinality on this, and there are specific property requests. We would like that you have a look to it, and then we can take it into account or not, even during the public review, in the sense that this is really valuable or not. So therefore, we have planned a kickstart webinar on the 21st of October to look to the issues that are very precise and to discuss maybe some of the outcomes that we have heard today and say, okay, this we have addressed it in this way, this way, this way, so that we can have a short discussion or a longer discussion on some things, but trying to include as many as possible issues with concrete things. And our goal is then to end this process with a specification that addresses as much as possible issues around the 15th of November. And we take some time to prepare the release, and then beginning of the 1st of December, we have a new release.
Bert, you are unmuted.
Sorry. As Rutger already mentioned, we have categorized the GitHub issues. It's not always that trivial to do, but this is the following ordering. We have issues which are mostly closed, in the sense that they either won't fix, meaning there was no direct effect on the specification, or more questions, etc. There are some which are addressed already as fixed. Mostly there are kind of editorial changes and things where we considered we can address it and include it already in the draft specification that is already on GitHub. And there are some few pointed that we actually cannot address on their own, but are referenced to discussions in W3C, where if we want to continue with this topic, must have an answer or a feedback from W3C. The goal is to close those and then see later on that these are, at least we expect these to close in our specification that comes out, a new release. And then we have topics which are more open. On some of them we have the status resolution provided, means that there is a concrete resolution provided, but they are not yet included in the draft specification because we believe that there should be at least some community feedback to say, okay, yes, go ahead. But with that, there are others, and that's why some lists with feedback requested, not always complicated feedback, but do you agree or not? So there is a proposal in most of them, not in all, but in most of them there is a proposal. We would like to have feedback from you as a community. And then we have the topic cataloged resource, which is the one that we discussed in the beginning of the profile, and that has to deal with that. So that are those with that. Our homework would be mostly towards, of course, these ones: resolution provided, feedback requested, and cataloged resource, in the sense that can you have a look to it, and if you have some additional feedback, yeah, please do. There are a few kept in future work that are not, will be postponed. There's some of them already have been announced, kind of with regard to the HTML representation, but that will be done for the next release. So we try to organize it. If you disagree, and if you say, okay, I really want to discuss on something more, it's unclear what it is, don't hesitate to comment in the issue. So they are not gone yet. We only close them and remove them after the release. That's the goal. So at least that you have this outline with it. So that you have that. So this is the homework. Then I have some announcements set, or Pavlina, you would like to do?
Yeah, so on the 6th of October, we have the follow-up of, I would say, the revision process of our core vocabulary. So many of you, of course, here in this group also attend or are part of that community. So we'll be looking forward to welcome you for that. And of course, also there's the main event, the SEMIC Action, I would say the main communication event, taking place on the 8th of December. And we're very happy to organize this event with the EU presidency. And so as we're speaking, we're wrapping up the program. And so normally we'll be able to send out the first version of the program, I would say, in probably 2 or 3 weeks. Voilà. But if there aren't any open standing issues, I was very glad with the very good level of discussions we had. A lot of important topics were discussed. And so looking forward to see you back then on the 21st of October. And don't hesitate to connect with us through the GitHub for the issues. But if you have particular questions or comments, also you can contact Pavlina or myself over email. See you next time.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Yeah, and you will get the slides, and in the slides as well, you will find as well the remaining topics and already an outline for the webinar of the 21st, so that you can have better browsing through the issues, etc. So that can aid you in browsing issues.
Thank you, everybody, for attending this meeting. We also see some discussion into the charter. We will take this under consideration. See you the 21st of October. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.